Elisha had been called by God as an instrument of change in his world. Elijah had been directly confronting the evil in society and its rulers that they had gravitated toward. But now it was time for Elijah to leave and new leadership to carry on the battle. It was going to be a changing of the guard. And we'll see that Elisha will go in a new direction. On one hand, Elijah had a ministry of confrontation. But the ministry God described for Elisha and the two kings that Elijah was instructed to go and anoint would be a ministry of the sword. We looked at that last week. They were going to remove God's stubborn enemies. But on the other hand, as we examine Elisha's life and Elijah's ministry, we find that he had a ministry of fire and judgment displayed against the kings of Israel, this confrontation, and that continues until the removal of Ahab's dynasty. But we'll see Elisha's style, as we're looking at his life, being one of healing and provision. There will be a shift in how they operate and the ministry that they do. Elisha was not just a clone of Elijah. He wasn't expected to just continue doing what had always been done. But he was the man God had called for that hour to accomplish leading Israel back towards him. Elijah was the man of the hour for his hour. But that hour came to an end, and then it became the time for Elisha. And last week we saw Elijah throw his mantle over Elisha, and Elisha left his family farm to follow him and went off to become his disciple. Elisha kind of became an apprentice of Elijah. That's how training was done pretty much in any professional field back in the day. A person wanted to learn a profession, you would become a student of someone who knew that profession. If you wanted to be a mechanic, you went to study at a garage under a mechanic. If you wanted to be a carpenter, you learned from a carpenter. If you wanted to be a prophet, you went and learned that profession from the prophets. In the New Testament, we call that process discipleship, but they didn't have Bible colleges and seminary back in the Old Testament. Okay, they hadn't been invented yet. You studied the ministry by serving in the ministry of those who were already doing ministry. And so Elisha was called and signed on to serve with Elijah. He became his protege, his assistant, his apprentice, until the time came for him to replace Elijah. Now, how long was that apprenticeship? Well, the Bible doesn't say. Okay, if you want a specific time, the Bible doesn't say how much time it really was between Elisha's calling back in 1 Kings chapter 19 and Elijah being caught up in heaven in 2 Kings chapter 2. However, there are some events that happened between those two things, and based on that research, most scholars estimate it was somewhere between 6 and 10 years. There was probably 6 to 10 years that Elisha was the apprentice of Elijah. That time frame makes sense. You know, that's about how long he would go. If you went to Bible college and seminary today, you'd probably spend a good 6 to 10 years if you wanted to become a pastor. Unless you were really slow like me, you know, then it might take longer. Okay, but for most, you know, it's that 6 to 10 year process. So after spending 6 years, at least 6 years working with Elijah, maybe as many as 10 years, the day came when it was time for God to remove Elijah. He was going to remove Elijah, and then Elisha would become his replacement. Now here's what happened. Let's begin in 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 1. The time had come for the Lord to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind. Elijah and Elisha were traveling from Gilgal. And Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here. The Lord is sending me on to Bethel." But Elisha replied, "As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they went on to Bethel. Then the sons of the prophets who were at Bethel came out to Elisha and said, "Do you know that the Lord will take your master away from you today?" He said, "Yes, I know. Be quiet." Elijah said to him, "Elisha, stay here. The Lord is sending me to Jericho." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they went on to Jericho. Then the sons of the prophets who were in Jericho came up to Elisha and said, "Do you know that the Lord will take your master away from you today?" He said, "Yes, I know, be quiet." Elijah said to him, "Stay here." The Lord is sending me to the Jordan." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So the two of them went on. 50 men from the sons of the prophets came and stood observing them in the distance, while the two of them stood by the Jordan. Elijah took off his mantle, rolled it up, and struck the water, which parted to the right and the left. Then the two of them crossed over on dry ground. When they had crossed over, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me what I can do for you before I am taken from you." So Elijah answered, "Please let me inherit 2 shares of your spirit." Elijah replied, "You have asked for something difficult. If you see me being taken from you, you will have it. If not, you won't." As they continued walking and talking, a chariot of fire with horses of fire suddenly appeared and separated the two of them. Then Elijah went up into heaven in the whirlwind, and Elisha watched. He kept crying out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." When he could see him no longer, he took hold of his own clothes and tore them in two. About 2 years ago, we looked at this passage, but perhaps more from Elijah's perspective. This time we're going to focus more heavily on Elisha's perspective. But if you want to look back at the specifics of the journey, their journey to the Jordan, or the times God, parted water, you can check that out. The video's on YouTube. It's called "Are You Ready for the Whirlwind?" Okay, so that's on YouTube if you want to see it. Elisha and the sons of the prophets, which would have been those practicing or studying prophecy, studying to be prophets, the prophets that were, assigned to serve under them in their day, knew that it was time for the Lord to take Elijah away. Okay, it seems common knowledge among them. It's time. He's going. They all knew God was about to make this big change in the religious structure of Israel and keep bringing it to Elisha's attention. Everywhere they go, they say, "Hey, Elisha, don't you know your master's about to be taken from you?" And he says, "Be quiet. Don't bring it up." Now, you might think he would be getting excited about becoming Elijah's replacement, but that's not what we see in Elisha. That's not the character we see in this man. As they go through their travels at God's direction, Elisha, knowing it's time, sticks to Elijah like glue. No matter where he goes, "I'm not leaving you. Nothing's going to separate me from you." He would not leave him alone. I mean, it was kind of like Donkey following Shrek. Okay? And if you understand the personalities of Donkey and Shrek, that's even more funny. Okay? Because I think Elisha and Elijah might fit those personalities. But finally, Elijah says to Elisha, "Tell me what I can do for you before I am taken from you." The fact that it was Elijah's time to go was not hidden from Elijah either. The prophets knew it. Elisha knew it. Elijah knew it. They all knew it. This was the time. God has appointed it. He's going to be taken up to heaven. What did Elisha want? Why is he sticking to him like glue? It's time for him to be separated, so what does he want? Does he want some great miracle? Does he want to see signs and wonders? Does he want a public endorsement? No. None of that's what he asked for. What he asked for is to inherit 2 shares of Elijah's spirit. Now, there is a dynamic of the firstborn inheriting 2 shares from the father, and all the others only getting 1 share, so that might be part of this picture. But I think what Elijah is really saying here is he wants to be empowered, double empowered, for the ministry that lays ahead. He's interested in he needs Elijah's power, this power that Elijah has. He knows he's the one who's going to be taking care of things. He needs that power. And Elisha knew the road ahead was going to be difficult. Israel was still a pagan nation at this point. They were still worshiping Baal. While the prophets were making a comeback, they were still in hostile territory. And all the miracles that Elijah had performed, seeing all the things that had happened, were not enough to make the evil kings repent. Elisha felt he needed 2 shares of Elijah's spirit if he's going to carry on that work to a new level of success. Now, this wasn't easy. If we look again at verse 10 of chapter 2, it says, Elijah responded, "You have asked for something difficult. If you see me being taken from you, you will have it. If not, you won't." And Elijah basically leaves it to God's hands. God can grant this to Elisha. God can refuse it to Elisha. It's up to God to do this request. If God lets Elisha see Elijah being taken up to heaven, then his request has been granted. But if not, then it has not been granted. He puts it in God's hands. And it's really up to God whether or not he's going to give this empowerment. Because the empowerment comes from God. It wasn't Elijah's power, it was God's power resting on Elijah. So they continued on in their conversation. They're walking along, and suddenly a chariot of fire with horses of fire appear and separates the two of them. It goes right in the middle of them. Now, I don't know about you, flaming horses get my attention. It's just, something about me. Elijah was then separated from him, and he's taken up to heaven in a whirlwind. Whirlwinds in the Bible are an interesting study. They often seem to go along with God's appearances, displays of God's power, or sometimes his judgment. But if you look up that term in the Bible, that's usually where that lands. Verse 12, we read how his reaction. As Elisha watched, he kept crying out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." When he could no longer see him, he took hold of his own clothes and tore them in two. Elisha's reaction was to mourn over Elijah. He wasn't excited to see him go. He wasn't just saying, "Oh, good, see you later, see you in heaven, I got my promotion now." That wasn't where Elisha was. He gets the number 1 seat, like you would see in so many secular transitions to power. Elisha genuinely seems to feel a sense of loss over Elijah leaving. And not just for himself. He's losing his friend, his mentor, his teacher, but he feels it for the whole nation. Elisha was losing this person, but Israel was losing the one man who had stood between them and destruction. The one man who had been God's voice in a wicked nation to wicked kings who were rebellious against God. The one-man army who had been keeping them from being completely overrun by evil. And now he's gone. When Elijah was completely out of sight, Elisha tore his clothes in two. And this was a sign of mourning, of being in extreme emotional distress. Now, in our culture, we probably just tend to wear black. Okay, when we're mourning, we're unhappy, we wear black. But they would actually tear their clothes. Something because it was gone, something they could never have back. And clothing in the ancient world, understand, was handmade and very expensive. They didn't have Walmart, okay? Everything wasn't made in China. You had to make it there. It was expensive. It was handmade. And so destroying it was a significant sacrifice. And it signaled an internal state that was too painful for words. They're expressing this deep internal pain. They're showing in their outward appearance that their heart has been ripped in two, or like their life has been ripped apart by this traumatic event. And so in their culture, it's how they would respond to a tragic loss. You see it several times in the Bible when something really tragic happens. And this is how Elisha reacts to seeing Elijah carried away to heaven. Now, fair to Elisha, seeing people carried away in whirlwinds is probably a little traumatic. Okay, that may be a fair statement. So, the first thing that we should specifically note is that even though Elisha is the replacement of Elijah, he was appointed by God, he's been training for this mission for 6 to 10 years, Elisha was not in a hurry to get rid of Elijah. He wasn't just trying to take over. He loved his master and grieved over losing him. The second thing that we should specifically notice is that in order for Elisha to assume the mantle of Elijah, in order for him to go forward in the ministry which he had been called, in order for the nation of Israel to go forward to the next chapter of God's plan for them, Elisha had to endure the loss and the grief created in the wake of the whirlwind. He had to lose Elijah. Your greatest ministry will often come from the very thing that breaks your heart. Your greatest ministry will often come from the very thing that breaks your heart. We often get attached to charismatic leaders. Okay, people who have had great impact on society or even on us personally. Maybe an example is we love Billy Graham. Okay, right? Billy Graham, everybody loved Billy Graham. He was the pastor to the presidents. And I feel like I can say that about Billy Graham because he actually is the one person who met with every U.S. president from Harry S. Truman to Barack Obama. Billy Graham met every single one of them, prayed for every single one of them. He had a 60-year span of access to the Oval Office. That's unheard of from any other religious figure. In his explaining his relationship to the presidents, to all the presidents, Graham said this. He said, "I am not a right-wing or a left-wing politician. I am a messenger of the gospel." That was his position. He was there for the gospel. He was there for Jesus. He wanted to communicate God's word and to pray for the presidents. Now, Billy Graham's passing away was an extreme loss to the Christian community. I think the Christian community felt that loss. It was big shoes that just cannot be filled. Maybe we can relate to what Elisha was going through at this moment. Now, for those who are a little younger, maybe a different example for a younger generation might be the death of Charlie Kirk. Many might have seen him as a more fiery type, an Elijah type. You know, he's confronting Baal worship in his own temple, type of a dynamic. But in both cases, what I think we saw in the Christian community was that Christians widely mourned the loss of a leader that they felt was being instrumental in leading the nation back the right direction. Okay, so Christians suffered this mourning when they lost this person. But here's the thing. When God's going to do something new, he usually doesn't use someone who is already doing a different ministry. Instead, God usually calls up someone to do new ministry and take things in a new direction. He calls up a new person. You might say God doesn't tend to put new wine in old wineskins. I think that's the way Jesus put it. So, if you're going to experience national revival, national repentance, it isn't likely going to come from the sources that have already been in operation for many years. In all likelihood, it will come from their successors, the next generation rising up. God's probably not going to pull someone out of the retirement home to start the new revival. Okay? He's much more likely to pull someone out of college. Now, you may not like that. At my age, I may not like that either. Okay, I'm getting up there with y'all. But it's the truth. It's what you see repeated over and over in history. God raises up new leaders for the new day. To get that person, to have that person being the new leader, you must endure the pain and the grief of losing the person you had in that spiritual place before them. That is what Elisha is going through. He is losing Elijah, his spiritual mentor. But that's what's necessary for him to go forward. Israel is losing their spiritual guide, but that is what was necessary for them to go forward. They must be replaced with Elisha. Now let's continue the story, and we're going to back up to verse 12. We'll start up again in verse 12, but see kind of the continuing of Elisha's reaction. As Elisha watched, he kept crying out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." When he could see him no longer, he took hold of his own clothes and tore them in two, picked up the mantle that had fallen off Elijah, and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. He took the mantle Elijah had dropped, and he struck the water. "Where is the Lord God of Elijah?" he asked. He struck the water himself, and it parted to the right and the left, and Elisha crossed over. When Elijah was taken up to heaven, his mantle, I would assume that mantle was the same one that he threw over Elisha at his calling, fell off and was left behind. Why? Why was it left behind? Well, it was the symbol of Elijah's prophetic ministry. Where Elijah was going, he wasn't going to need it anymore. His job's done. Elijah's work is done. However, the prophetic ministry to Israel is not done. It was not finished. The ministry in Israel was being passed on to Elisha. Elisha picked up the mantle, which probably was like a shawl or a cape, but probably made of furs. He picked up that mantle and he went back to the Jordan River, same spot they had just been, same spot he and Elijah had just crossed over before. When they crossed before, Elijah rolled it up and hit the water and it split. And so what does Elisha do? Well, he takes the mantle, that symbol of Elijah's prophetic ministry, and he strikes the water just like Elijah had done, and it parts for him as well. Elijah was gone. But Elisha asks a question when he's striking the water. And pay close attention to the question, because he does not ask, "Where is Elijah?" Hey, think about that. He just lost Elijah. He could very easily stand and say, "Where is Elijah?" No, that's not what he does. In his grief, he does not ask that. He says, "Where is the Lord God of Elijah?" He's not looking for Elijah. He's looking for the God of Elijah. And I think this is key to the biblical transition of leadership as God works in our society. We don't keep our eyes on the leaders as they come and go, and they will come and go. We keep our eyes on the Lord. It's about keeping your eyes on the Lord. See, last week we saw that Elijah knew where to run when he was in trouble. Well, now I think we can see that Elisha knows where to look as well. He knows to call to the Lord. That's who he's looking for. And so Elisha was grieving this loss for Elijah, but his focus is already moved to the Lord. And the Lord has given him this double portion of Elijah's spirit. He did see Elijah go up. The mantle was left for him. And so now by parting the waters, it shows that he has the empowerment needed for the mission that lay ahead, the mission of restoring a nation to the Lord. Elijah's ready to go forward. Verse 15. When the sons of the prophets from Jericho, who were observing, saw him, they said, "The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha." They came to meet him and bowed down to the ground in front of him. So the sons of the prophet have been standing on the other side of the river. They've been watching. They see Elisha part the Jordan River and makes it clear to them that now the spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha. You know, we've seen Elijah do this. Now we've seen Elisha do it. He now has the power. God has put it upon him, his spirit. They already knew that Elisha was Elijah's chosen replacement. That had already been made plain. They already knew that this was the day Elijah was going to be taken from them. They all came and told Elisha about it. But seeing Elisha part the Jordan River gave an unquestionable indication that the transfer had taken place. Elisha has now replaced Elijah. And just a brief on the parting the waters. You know, it's actually kind of a rare miracle in the Bible. You know, Moses parted the Red Sea. You remember that? But Joshua had the priests carry the ark into the Jordan River, and it parted when they were going into the Promised Land. And so there was kind of a dynamic of it showed the transfer of power from Moses to Joshua, when the waters parted as Israel crossed. Well, Elijah parted the Jordan River with his mantle, and now Elisha repeats this miracle, showing that Elijah's power and authority has transferred to Elisha. So it's a very rare miracle. You only see it in those two occurrences. Even Jesus did not part any water. Yeah, he didn't have to. He just walked across the top. Doesn't have to part. So that's a different story. But even though everyone knew Elijah was gone and Elisha was his replacement, this was now common knowledge among the prophets, and the Lord has brought all this into happen, look at what happens next. Watch what happens next. Let's continue in verse 16. Then the sons of the prophets said to Elisha, "Since there are 50 strong men here with your servants, please let them go and search for your master. Maybe the Spirit of the Lord has carried him away and put him on one of the mountains or into one of the valleys." He answered, "Don't send them." However, they urged him to the point of embarrassment. So he said, "Send them." They sent 50 men who looked for 3 days, but they did not find him. When they returned to him in Jericho, where he was staying, he said to them, "Didn't I tell you not to go?" The sons of the prophets urged Elisha to send a large search party, 50 guys out, to go and search for Elijah. And at first, Elisha refused. Don't search for him. We already know where he's gone. God caught him up into heaven. This has been the whole plan. Don't waste your time. But they kept pressing the issue with him to the point that he was embarrassed to say no. He doesn't want it to look like he wants Elijah out of the way. And so Elisha gives in and says, "Okay, go ahead, do your search if you want to." They spend 3 days searching. They come back. They say, "Hey, we didn't find him." He's, "Well, didn't I tell you not to go?" Go figure. Why would they do this? Didn't the sons of the prophets tell Elisha that Elijah was going to be taken away from him on that day? Haven't we seen that in the story? Everywhere they went, this group of the prophets that were there come up to Elisha and say, "Hey, today is the day your master is going to be taken." Didn't they believe their own prophecy? They told him. They knew he was going. Didn't the sons of the prophets watch? 50 of them were standing there watching as Elisha parted the river with Elijah's mantle. And they came to the conclusion that now the spirit of Elijah was resting on Elisha. Didn't we just read that? Okay, so we know that the power has transferred. The position has transferred. We know, in fact, they may have even seen Elijah go. So why did they want to search for Elijah when they already knew he wasn't there? I'm going to suggest that this is a part of human nature that we have to deal with and guard against in ministry. We see it repeatedly in the Bible. People knowing that God has turned the page. They know what God is doing. They know where God is leading. He has moved them forward into a new day. But their hearts insist on going back and searching for what used to be. People have a natural tendency to want to return to the past. Even when they can't, even when they know they can't. Their feelings often override all sensibleness in this matter. When God freed Israel from slavery, He led them out of Egypt. He did great signs and wonders destroying Egypt. And they get out in the wilderness, and what do the people keep doing all the way for 40 years? They keep saying, "Let's go back to Egypt." Why? Didn't they know that God is the one who did this? There's the pillar of fire. Here we are free. We're out of Egypt. And God, they kept, every time there was a problem, they wanted to go back. Now, maybe a story that's just a little more modern would help us see it in us. A story that I kind of like. It's from First Baptist Church of Dallas, Texas. They had I think the longest consecutive running of 2 pastors. And actually at this point it might be of 3 pastors. Between these 2 men, they pastored the church for almost 100 years. That's a long time. Okay, that's a long time. The first pastor was G.W. Truitt. He was the pastor from 1897 until 1944. Pastor of First Baptist Church, Dallas, Texas, and that's when he died. Okay, he stayed pastor until he died. That's the way he did it. That does kind of end pastoring. Okay, they don't usually once you're dead, you have to retire. I mean, you may put off retirement until then, but at that point, it's done. They don't let you pastor anymore after that. He was replaced by W.A. Criswell, who pastored from 1944 until 1994. And then, actually, he didn't entirely retire. He went into semi-retirement and became the senior pastor, and they had a new main pastor. However, when Criswell started pastoring First Baptist Church of Dallas, he ran into a problem. They didn't want him to change anything. Okay, the pastor before had been there almost 50 years. They didn't want him to change anything. Everything he tried to do, no matter what he said, he heard about how Pastor Truett always did it. Well, this is the way Pastor Truett has always done it. The church had rightly loved their pastor, but they had wrongly enshrined him. The only thing in the church that is supposed to be worshiped is Jesus. Okay, not any pastor. Pastors come and go. Jesus stays. Now, I don't know if any of you ever plan to go into ministry, into pastoral ministry, but let me tell you, if you're called to pastor in a church that's had a long-term pastor before you, and long-term these days is anything over 2 years. Okay, if you get called into that kind of a church, you will encounter this problem. Okay, this is going to happen. You will face it. Probably takes more than 2 years. It takes 5 to 10 years to get there. But the number one obstacle in going forward is that the hearts of the people really want to go back to where they used to be. That's the number one problem. So what did Pastor Criswell do? Well, my understanding, the story goes like this. He took down all the portraits of Pastor Truett. Apparently in their facility, they had over 50 portraits of their pastor. I mean, they might have had more pictures of him than they did of Jesus. I mean, just saying. But he got all the portraits throughout all the facilities, and he put them on the altar of the church in the worship area. And he preached a sermon entitled, Moses, God's Man is Dead. Now, Moses was God's man. He was God's man for the hour. He was a great man, and he should be remembered for all that God did through him. But his hour passed, and he had to hand it on to Joshua. God raised someone new to the task. Likewise, Pastor Truett, he had been God's man for the hour. He had done great things in that church. He had pastored them and served them for almost 50 years, but the Lord chose to take him home. He isn't coming back. Okay? They should remember him, they should respect him, but they needed to move on to what God was doing now. And that was the difficulty they had. This is, I think, what Elisha's facing. He's getting a taste of that. The sons of the prophets, they know Elijah's gone. They know what God's doing. They know Elisha's the replacement, but they're still searching for Elijah. And now, in order to get the mission going forward, they have to get past that search. Now, here's where we need to always take a look at ourselves, because the biggest hindrance in us going forward with Jesus is usually our own 2 feet. Okay, the biggest hindrance in us going forward with Jesus is our own 2 feet, because our feet keep wanting to go backwards. Okay, I'm my worst enemy when it comes to these things. Where in your life has God been trying to move you forward? Where in your life, and maybe it's an area where something has been stripped away, that God's taken something from you, life has taken it from you, and you can't have it back. Where in your life is God trying to move you forward? Maybe you've heard this before. It's part of a prayer called the Serenity Prayer. It goes like this. It says, God, grant me serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. it's in living out that prayer that we find the strength to pick up the mantle of God's mission for our lives and keep going forward in the assignment God's given us. You have to know, Elijah's gone, I can't change it. You have to accept the mantle is ready to be picked up. I now have to carry it. You have to have the wisdom to know the difference in order to move forward. And there are things that God has ordained that you will not change. And there are things that may seem impossible to change, but God has called you to be an agent of change and make it happen. Wisdom is knowing the difference. You need God's guidance to know the difference, and you need a heart that is surrendered to His will so that you can walk the correct path. To pick up the mantle and walk with Him, you must surrender to His will. I think we see that in Elisha. He surrendered to God's will. And I believe this does apply to every Christian as they walk with Christ, but it can also apply in terms of our own nation. We need to recognize that we can't necessarily go back to what we once were. George Washington isn't going to come back from the grave and become our president again. Okay, we might like it, but it's not going to happen. In fact, years ago, I was working as a cashier. I've done a lot of different jobs. I was working as a cashier, and this was back when they had just started releasing the state's quarters. You remember all the excitement? Each quarter, each state had its own quarter, and they were illustrating a new state on each one. And I think George Bush was the president at the time. And an elderly woman came through my line and turned out that her daughter was with her. And they made a purchase, and I gave her her change. And this is back when people used cash. You can't make change, okay? You had to count it back, okay? As back when cashiers knew how to count. Okay, that's a different story. The elderly woman got angry with me. And she barked, "I paid you with American currency, and you can't give me change in this English money." And I looked at the coins she was complaining about, and they were the freshly minted state's quarters. Those new, in fact, I think it was the one with the sailboat on it, if I remember right. And I tried to explain, these are American money. They're just the brand new state's quarters. And she looked at me like I was an idiot. She said, "States don't have their own quarters." And at that moment, her daughter kind of stepped in, said, "It's okay, Mom, it's okay." And I was trying to still smooth things over. I was trying to smooth it over, and I pointed out that, okay, the state's on the back, but, George is still on the front. She said, "Well, I'm not too happy with him either." Now, I'm not sure if she personally knew George Washington, or if she was talking about George Bush. I don't know which George she meant. Whichever, she wasn't happy. She wasn't happy. But see, here's the reality. Even if George Washington did come back from the grave and become president again, people still wouldn't be happy. They wouldn't be happy. They argued back when he was president, too. We don't need what God has done in the past. What we need is what He has called us to be in the present. What He has called us to do as His people, as His church, in the present. And we need His empowerment in the present so we can prepare for our future with Jesus. For us to go forward as an individual, as a believer, or as a nation, we have to let go of what was and move forward with what God has called us to be and to do in Christ. Keep walking with Jesus. You won't go wrong. Thank you for watching this video. If you live in the greater Phoenix area, we would love to have you come and worship with us in person any Sunday morning at 9:30 a.m. The Meadows Baptist Church is located at 3701 West Beardsley Road. That's the side road of the 101, just west of 35th Avenue. We would love to have you pop by as we celebrate Jesus together.